to take human interest in their patients. So the investigation took months and ended sometime in 1934, right around the time of the elections for the Commonwealth government. The Malacanang Committee released a 16-point recommendation aiming to restructure the PGH. Lawmakers called for the creation of a board of directors and the removal of Calderon. But Quezon, who was on track to becoming the Commonwealth president, came to the rescue of the PGH and Calderon. When the dust settled, the PGH saw little restructuring and Calderon remained unscathed. On the part of the hospital, administrative changes were in order. A number of doctors voted for expanding the hospital's charity wards, but top officials scrapped this proposal on grounds that state subsidy would not allow it. Moreover, the top officials were not keen in opening cheaper wards on grounds that they could rile up the PFPMP. Hence, the hospital settled to the lowest hanging fruit, an administrative measure that was certainly amenable to the PFPMP, means testing, putting in place a stricter screening process for its charity ward applicants. So in 1935, the PGH created the hospital's extension service unit, whose function was to deploy nurses and social workers to check up on patients sent home by their doctors. But more importantly, they were sent to investigate, quote, investigate the financial situation of the indigent cases. Then the unit deliberated if the indigent, the patient could afford to pay as a regular patient. If the patient was found to fail their criterion of indigency, the patient was billed as a regular patient. In conditions of material scarcity, means testing could be used as a mechanism to guarantee equitable access to a government service. In the case of the PGH Extension Service in 1934, there was no study on the relationship of people's ability to pay their hospital bills and their social conditions. The creation of the PGH Extension Service Unit came from doctors' anecdotes that cast a great majority of charity patients were frauds. There was a belief that placing punitive measures to catch and make them pay would, one, increase the pay section of the hospital, and two, solve overcrowding. But this belief was not backed with a thorough study, but merely anecdotes. One anecdote was shared by a top official who came across a charity patient wearing costly jewels and silk dress, who upon investigation turned out to be a former teacher who used to earn 40 pesos a month. Anecdotes such as this were devoid of any deeper inquiry of the patient's conditions, but they were steeped with contempt and suspicion. Aside from attitudes of contempt and suspicion, no acknowledgement was made that the PGH suffered from structural flaws. No acknowledgement of the fact that the PGH back then had no system of accountability nor a system of prioritization of care which resembled present-day triage. The extension service might have had value in serving other functions, such as providing domiciliary nurses, which were sorely needed in the 1930s Manila's medical landscape, where infant mortality remained high. However, the extension services value as a solution to the hospital's overcrowding is somewhat doubtful. In its first months of operation, um, the ex- in the first few months of the extension service unit's operation, only 5% out of the study cases from Manila were judged as capable of paying, and around 9% of those from the provinces. So on September 10, 1935, the English language Manila-based newspaper, The Herald, published a special supplementary issue to celebrate the PGH's Silver Jubilee. In the middle of the front page was a curious editorial entitled More Financial Support Needed by Hospitals from Community. And I quote, while the people have learned to take advantage of hospital facilities, they have not learned yet to support these institutions financially. It is regrettable that the tendency of the masses is to abuse the charity services of these life-saving organizations. The reports coming from different hospitals in the Philippines show that there is a considerable increase in the number of patients seeking admission to the charity wards and a corresponding decrease in the pay section. These institutions are not money-making enterprises, but they should receive enough income from their activities to cover operating expenses. At present, their average income is hardly sufficient to defray 50% of their expenses. It is a good sign that the people come to learn how to use hospital services when they are ill, but they have not learned to render as much financial assistance as they can to these institutions. It is a common occurrence to see people shopping with cash, ready to pay for the commodities they wish to purchase. But to see people go to hospitals ready to pay for whatever services are rendered them still services are rendered them is still a rare experience. Hospitals are like churches and schools. They can no longer be considered separate and distinct from the community. They are indispensable to the happiness and progress of the people. No community is complete without them. These institutions that dispense charity cannot live on charity alone. For their stability and in order that they may continue to render the greatest good to the community, the people must support them financially, not necessarily by gifts or donations, but by paying for the services which they receive. Just as they pay for commodities purchased, so should they pay for services received. The nature and extent of the service of hospitals depend largely upon the financial support they get from the community. Anyway, so that's a longer version of the um, editorial, well, additional paragraphs still, there are still additional paragraphs. So the editorial, in essence, magnified the anecdotes and assumption as a general situation for the whole country. It bore the same suspicious sentiment. It assumed that a great number of patients applying for charity actually had the means to afford paying. It placed the blame on the masses for not yet learning to appreciate the hospitals as beyond charity institutions. From this point forward, the emphasis on the urgency to means test became a common theme in legislations. In general, legislation assumed the theoretical fraud was taking place and demanded the state to weed out the fraud. It came from a position of contempt and suspicion, never from a strong commitment to equity and social rights. Legislation deployed an idealized fixed legal category, but prescriptions as to what made an individual meet this legal category never took the point of view of an actual person who needed state relief. Health related bills that prescribed means testing never took the view of the charity patient, but that of a government doctor worried of offending private practitioners. Okay. In 1938, a frenzy of legislations took place following the granting of the coconut excise tax revenues by the US Federal Treasury. One bill authored by a Nueva Ecija assemblyman sought the establishment of a national welfare home. I did not find a copy of the bill, but a Manila Bulletin clipping, which I will read, kind of mirrors the same level of contempt and suspicion that the previous point of views kind of conveyed. And I quote the Manila Bulletin clipping. He said, the assemblyman, he said, not all persons found begging are really destitute or indigent, since many of them beg simply because they find it a lucrative profession. These professional beggars should be weeded out from the group of those who really are indigent. He proposes to have it organized in such form that it will not become a financial burden to the government. The proposed institution would be operated as a farm where able-bodied inmates would be set to productive work. He asks 300,000 for the establishment of a national welfare home. He proposes to have it organized in such form that it will not be a financial burden to the government anyway. So before he was elected as president of the Commonwealth, Manuel L. Quezon made campaign declarations short of promising for socialist medicine. But once elected president, however, his enthusiasm became tempered. In 1939, Quezon declared his government set out to build 500 rural clinics throughout the country under his so-called social justice program. So compared to the bills, this actually happened through executive order. Quezon's program was bogged down by plenty of restrictions and caveats apparently set by lobbyists from PFPMP. First, these rural clinics acquired the name National Charity Clinics, limited only to indigents. Second, a rural clinic was headed by a private doctor under contract with the government to perform an outreach in exchange for permission to set up a private practice in his area of deployment. Third, only medical licentiates not older than 35 years old was eligible. So the point being, when a proposal to actually expand government medical service was actually implemented, it was bogged down by a lot of restrictions and caveats set by private doctors. So this, in a way, kind of showed that from the time that means testing became a national ideology, expansion of the government medical services became an uphill battle. And there are many examples that we can mention from after the Second World War. But in the interest of time, the 1939 National Charity Clinics of Quezon kind of exemplified that kind of difficulty. So anyway, as my closing remarks, in my presentation, I sought to provisionally answer the question, why the Philippines never had socialized medicine? And I identified a historical conjuncture that elevated means testing as a national ideology. The institutionalization of means testing made subsequent efforts to universalize healthcare difficult. It would take decades for a new paradigm of horizontalist healthcare delivery to emerge. in the 1970s when the Alma Ata WHO conference took place and declared that the era of disease eradication is over, and the era of primary health care has begun. Anyway, that's all. Thank you very much.